It has been stated in German publications that Botter, for the great services rendered by him to the Elector and to Saxony, was made manager of the Royal Porcelain Works, and further promoted to the dignity of Baron. Doubtless he deserved these honors. But his treatment was of an altogether different character, for it was shabby, cruel, and inhuman. 2 royal officials, named Matthew and Nemitz, were put over his head as directors of the factory, while he himself only held the position of foreman of potters, and at the same time was detained the king's prisoner. During the erection of the factory at Meissen, while his assistance was still indispensable, he was conducted by soldiers to and from Dresden, and even after the works were finished, he was locked up nightly in his room. All this preyed upon his mind, and in repeated letters to the king he sought to obtain mitigation of his fate. Some of these letters are very touching. "I will devote my whole soul to the art of making porcelain," he writes on one occasion. "I will do more than any inventor ever did before. Only give me liberty, liberty." To these appeals, the king turned a deaf ear. He was ready to spend money and grant favors, but liberty he would not give. He regarded Botter as his slave. In this position, the persecuted man kept on working for some time, till, at the end of a year or two, he grew negligent. Disgusted with the world and with himself, he took to drinking. Such is the force of example, that it no sooner became known that Botter had betaken himself to this vice, than the greater number of the workmen at the Meissen factory became drunkards too. Quarrels and fightings without end were the consequence, so that the troops were frequently called upon to interfere and keep peace among the Porzellanern, as they were nicknamed. After a while, the whole of them, more than 300, were shut up in the Albrechtsberg, and treated as prisoners of state. Botter at last fell seriously ill, and in May, 1713, his dissolution was hourly expected. The king, alarmed at losing so valuable a slave, now gave him permission to take carriage exercise under a guard. And, having somewhat recovered, he was allowed occasionally to go to Dresden. In a letter written by the king in April, 1714, Botter was promised his full liberty, but the offer came too late. Broken in body and mind, alternately working and drinking, though with occasional gleams of nobler intention, and suffering under constant ill health, the result of his enforced confinement, Botter lingered on for a few years more, until death freed him from his sufferings on the 13th of March, 1719, in the 35th year of his age. He was buried at night, as if he had been a dog, in the Johannes Cemetery of Meissen. Such was the treatment and such the unhappy end, of one of Saxony's greatest benefactors. The porcelain manufacture immediately opened up an important source of public revenue, and it became so productive to the Elector of Saxony, that his example was shortly after followed by most European monarchs. Although soft porcelain had been made at St. Cloud 14 years before Botter's discovery, the superiority of the hard porcelain soon became generally recognized. Its manufacture was begun at Sèvres in 1770, and it has since almost entirely superseded the softer material. This is now one of the most thriving branches of French industry, of which the high quality of the articles produced is certainly indisputable. The career of Josiah Wedgwood, the English potter, was less checkered and more prosperous than that of either Palissy or Botter, and his lot was cast in happier times. Down to the middle of last century England was behind most other nations of the first order in Europe in respect of skilled industry. Although there were many potters in Staffordshire, and Wedgwood himself belonged to a numerous clan of potters of the same name, their productions were of the rudest kind, for the most part only plain brown ware, with the patterns scratched in while the clay was wet. The principal supply of the better articles of earthenware came from Delft in Holland, and of drinking stone pots from Cologne. 2 foreign potters, the brothers Ehlers from Nuremberg, settled for a time in Staffordshire, and introduced an improved manufacture, but they shortly after removed to Chelsea, where they confined themselves to the manufacture of ornamental pieces. No porcelain capable of resisting a scratch with a hard point had yet been made in England. And for a long time the whiteware made in Staffordshire was not white, but of a dirty cream color. Such, in a few words, was the condition of the pottery manufacture when Josiah Wedgwood was born at Burslem in 1730. By the time that he died, 64 years later, it had become completely changed. By his energy, skill, and genius, he established the trade upon a new and solid foundation, and, in the words of his epitaph, converted a rude and inconsiderable manufacture into an elegant art and an important branch of national commerce. Josiah Wedgwood was one of those indefatigable men who from time to time spring from the ranks of the common people, and by their energetic character not only practically educate the working population in habits of industry, but by the example of diligence and perseverance which they set before them, largely influence the public activity in all directions, and contribute in a great degree to form the national character. He was, like Arkwright, the youngest of a family of 13 children. His grandfather and granduncle were both potters, as was also his father, who died when he was a mere boy, leaving him a patrimony of £20. He had learned to read and write at the village school, but on the death of his father he was taken from it and set to work as a thrower in a small pottery carried on by his elder brother. There he began life, his working life, to use his own words, at the lowest round of the ladder, when only 11 years old. He was shortly after seized by an attack of virulent smallpox, from the effects of which he suffered during the rest of his life, for it was followed by a disease in the right knee, which recurred at frequent intervals, and was only got rid of by the amputation of the limb many years later. Mr. Gladstone, in his eloquent eloge on Wedgwood recently delivered at Burslem, well observed that the disease from which he suffered was not improbably the occasion of his subsequent excellence. It prevented him from growing up to be the active, vigorous English workman, possessed of all his limbs, and knowing right well the use of them. But it put him upon considering whether, as he could not be that, he might not be something else, and something greater. It sent his mind inwards. It drove him to meditate upon the laws and secrets of his art. The result was, that he arrived at a perception and a grasp of them which might, perhaps, have been envied, certainly have been owned, by an Athenian potter. When he had completed his apprenticeship with his brother, Josiah joined partnership with another workman, and carried on a small business in making knife hafts, boxes, and sundry articles for domestic use. Another partnership followed, when he proceeded to make melon table plates, green pickle leaves, candlesticks, snuff boxes, and such like articles. But he made comparatively little progress until he began business on his own account at Burslem in the year 1759. There he diligently pursued his calling, introducing new articles to the trade, and gradually extending his business. What he chiefly aimed at was to manufacture cream-colored ware of a better quality than was then produced in Staffordshire as regarded shape, color, glaze, and durability. To understand the subject thoroughly, he devoted his leisure to the study of chemistry. And he made numerous experiments on fluxes, glazes, and various sorts of clay. Being a close inquirer and accurate observer, he noticed that a certain earth containing silica, which was black before calcination, became white after exposure to the heat of a furnace. This fact, observed and pondered on, led to the idea of mixing silica with the red powder of the potteries, and to the discovery that the mixture becomes white when calcined. He had but to cover this material with a vitrification of transparent glaze, to obtain one of the most important products of fictile art, that which, under the name of English earthenware, was to attain the greatest commercial value and become of the most extensive utility.